The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds of the lake house, cutting golden strips across the oak table, where Caroline and I used to share our coffee. I sat alone now, same chair, same mug, the blue ceramic one with the tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she'd say, running her thumb over the imperfection, the way she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and looked out at Clearview Lake. The water was mirror still reflecting the October sky like polished steel. Caroline had chosen this place 32 years ago, walking through rooms that smelled of sawdust and possibility. "This is where we'll grow old," she'd announced, as if the decision had been made by something larger than either of us. She'd been right, of course. We had grown old here. I just hadn't expected to finish the job alone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times each note, echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. I'd built most of the furniture myself, back when my hands were steadier, and my back didn't remind me of every ladder I'd climbed, every beam I'd lifted. The dining room table where we'd hosted Christmas dinners. The built-in bookshelves where Caroline arranged her mysteries and gardening magazines in perfect rows. The bay window seat where she'd curl up with her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with the rain. Everything here carried her fingerprints, her choices, her laughter. Even 3 years after the funeral, I sometimes caught myself setting 2 cups on the counter before remembering. The gravel driveway crunched under tires, a sound I'd grown to recognize from any room in the house. But this engine was unfamiliar newer, with the quiet hum of something expensive. I moved to the window and saw a black SUV pulling up beside my old Ford. The driver's door opened and out stepped my son. Ethan looked prosperous. That was the word Caroline would have used. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly pressed, the kind that costs more than I used to spend on clothes in a year. His hair was shorter than I remembered, touched with silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than aging. He moved with the confident stride of a man who expected doors to open for him. I hadn't seen him in 8 months, not since that stilted phone call where he'd mentioned needing some space to figure things out with Madison. I'd respected that space maybe more than I should have. Caroline had always been the bridge between us, translating my practical silences into words Ethan could understand, and his restless ambitions into something I could accept. Without her, we'd defaulted to the awkward politeness of distant relatives. A car door slammed, then another. A woman emerged from the passenger side, Madison, my daughter-in-law. Though she'd never seemed comfortable with that title, she wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her blonde hair swept back in one of those casual styles that takes an hour to achieve. Behind her, 2 older figures unfolded from the back seat. I recognized them from the wedding photos that still sat on Caroline's dresser, Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents. The 4 of them stood in my driveway like a delegation. Gerald adjusted his sport coat and surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of a man appraising real estate. Patricia clutched a leather handbag and whispered something to Madison that made my daughter-in-law nod with satisfaction. I opened the front door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days, better to meet trouble on your own terms than wait for it to find you. "Dad?" Ethan's smile was bright and brittle. "You look good." "Ethan?" I stepped back to let them pass. "Madison, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." Gerald's handshake was firm, aggressive. Patricia offered her cheek for an air kiss I didn't give. Madison smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes. The hallway suddenly felt crowded, filled with perfume and aftershave, and the particular tension that comes when people want something they haven't asked for yet. "Coffee," I offered, because Caroline had trained me to be a host even when I didn't feel like one. "This won't take long," Ethan said, which should have been my first warning. We gathered in the living room, them on the sofa. Caroline had reupholstered in soft green fabric, me in my reading chair with its view of the lake. Gerald's eyes roamed the room, taking inventory. He lingered on the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the custom-built entertainment center, the hardwood floors Caroline and I had refinished together one humid summer. "Beautiful place," Patricia said, but her tone suggested she was already planning changes. "It was Caroline's vision," I said. "She had ideas about everything down to which trees to plant, so they'd frame the view just right." Madison shifted uncomfortably. She'd never known how to respond when I mentioned Caroline. Some people freeze when confronted with grief, as if death might be contagious. "That's actually what we wanted to talk about," Ethan said. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. the posture of a man delivering important news. The future of this place. I waited. In construction, you learn that silence is often more powerful than words. People will fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intended to share. Madison's parents need a place to live, Ethan continued. Their lease is up next month, and with Dad's retirement, he gestured toward Gerald, who nodded gravely as if confirming a tragedy. We've been looking at senior communities, Gerald said, but the good ones have waiting lists, and the costs. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. They're family, Madison added, her voice soft but insistent. And this house has so much space, more than you need, really. The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel them waiting for my response, watching my face for signs of weakness or compliance. But I'd spent 40 years managing construction crews, negotiating with contractors, staring down building inspectors who thought they could intimidate an old man with a clipboard. My expression didn't change. I see, I said finally. We thought, Ethan said, speaking faster now, maybe it would be good for you too. All this space, all these memories. It might be time to downsize, move somewhere more manageable. Somewhere more manageable, I repeated. There's a nice senior community in Clearwater, Patricia offered brightly. Garden apartments, meal service activities. You'd have people your own age to socialize with. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The boy who'd learned to fish from this dock, who'd helped me build the tire swing that still hung from the old oak tree, who'd brought Caroline wildflowers from the meadow behind the house every Mother's Day until he left for college. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit who spoke about my life as if it were a problem to be solved. And if I don't want to move? I asked. The question caught them off guard. Gerald and Patricia exchanged glances. Madison's smile faltered. Ethan's jaw tightened in a way I remembered from his teenage years, when he'd been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. Dad, he said, his voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a child. Be reasonable. You're 73 years old. This house is too big, too isolated. What if you fall? What if something happens? What if it does? We worry about you, Madison said, though she'd never shown any evidence of worry before. Living out here alone with your heart condition, my heart condition is managed. Still, Ethan said. Wouldn't it be nice to have people around, to not have to worry about maintenance, yard work, all the things that get harder as we get older? I stood and walked to the window that faced the lake. The morning mist was burning off, revealing the water in all its October glory. Caroline's garden was still blooming, the late roses she'd babied through 15 summers, the Japanese maples she'd planted to turn brilliant red this time of year. The dock where we'd sat countless evenings watching the sun set behind the pines. This house isn't just a house, I said without turning around. It's Caroline's legacy. It's where we built our life together. She's gone, Dad. Ethan's voice was gentler now, but the words still cut. She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. I turned to face them, 4 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for me to crumble, to accept their logic, to make their lives easier by sacrificing my own. The house stays with me, I said quietly. Gerald leaned forward. Richard, let's be practical about this. The upkeep alone must be... The house stays with me, I repeated. Dad, Ethan stood, running a hand through his silver hair. We're trying to help you. Can't you see that? Help me what? Give up everything I've worked for, everything Caroline and I built together. Move on, Madison said sharply. That's what normal people do. They move on. The room went silent. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable with the naked honesty of it. But Madison had said what they were all thinking, that my grief was inconvenient, my attachment to this place unreasonable, my refusal to accommodate their plans selfish. I appreciate your concern, I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. But this is my home. It will remain my home until I decide otherwise. Ethan's face flushed. And what about family? What about helping people when they need it? You mean the family that visits twice a year, the family that calls on holidays and birthdays if they remember? That's not fair, isn't it? I looked at each of them in turn. When did you last ask how I was doing? Not what I could do for you, but how I was managing. When did you last visit just to spend time together? No one answered. I thought so, I said, Gerald cleared his throat. Perhaps we should take some time to think about this, explore other options. There are no other options, Patricia said, her mask of politeness finally slipping. We've looked everywhere. This is the only place that makes sense. For you, I said, not for me. Ethan's shoulders sagged. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who'd cry when he accidentally stepped on a bug, who'd told me I was the strongest man in the world. Dad, he said quietly, please, just think about it. Think about what Mom would have wanted. It was a low blow, and he knew it, using Caroline's memory as a weapon against me. But he'd miscalculated. I knew exactly what Caroline would have wanted. She'd have wanted me to stand my ground to protect what we'd built together, to not let anyone, even our son, take advantage of my grief. Your mother? I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Would have wanted you to respect your father. She would have wanted you to visit because you missed me, not because you needed something from me. She would have been heartbroken to see what you've become. The words landed like physical blows. Ethan stepped back, his face pale. Madison's mouth fell open. Gerald and Patricia looked toward the door, as if calculating their escape route. I think you should leave, I said. Dad, now. They filed out without another word. I watched from the window as they climbed back into the SUV, their body language stiff with indignation and disappointment. The engine started, gravel crunched, and they were gone, leaving only the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of words that couldn't be taken back. I returned to my chair and picked up my coffee mug. The liquid was cold now, but I drank it anyway, staring out at the lake that had witnessed 32 years of my marriage, 3 years of my widowhood, and now this, the final fracture in a relationship I'd once thought unbreakable. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the water, its voice lonely and wild. I set down the empty mug and allowed myself to feel the weight of what had just happened. My son had looked me in the eye and asked me to give up everything I'd worked for, everything Caroline and I had cherished, so his in-laws could have a place to live. He'd wrapped it in concern for my welfare, but the truth was simpler and uglier. I was an inconvenience, a problem to be solved, an old man whose feelings mattered less than their comfort. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't helpless. And I sure as hell wasn't giving up without a fight. Comment fair if you want the truth to be revealed. The silence after they left felt different from my usual solitude. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a man who'd chosen to be alone with his memories. It was the hollow echo of something breaking. I sat in my chair for a long time after the SUV disappeared, watching the lake change color as clouds drifted across the sun. The water went from mirror bright to pewter gray to deep blue, the way it had every day for 32 years, indifferent to human drama. Finally, I stood and began the ritual of straightening up, though there wasn't much to straighten. 4 coffee cups that had gone, unused cushions that needed refluffing where unwelcome visitors had sat. I carried the cups to the kitchen and washed them by hand the way Caroline had taught me. The dishwasher's for big messes, she'd say. These little things deserve personal attention. Personal attention. When had I stopped giving Ethan that? The question followed me as I moved through the house, checking windows, adjusting the thermostat, performing the small acts of maintenance that filled my days. In the hallway, I paused before the gallery wall Caroline had created, 3 decades of family photographs, arranged with her artist's eye for balance and story. There was Ethan, at 2 chocolate cakes smeared across his face at his birthday party. At 7, missing his front teeth, but grinning as he held up the base he'd caught off our dock. At 16, lanky and serious in his baseball uniform, the one season he'd played before, deciding sports weren't his thing. At 25, nervous and proud in his wedding tuxedo. Madison radiant beside him, in her grandmother's dress. I studied that last photo looking for clues I'd missed at the time. Had there been warning signs? Had Madison's smile been too practiced, too aware of the camera? Had Ethan's hand on her waist been possessive rather than protective? Or was I reading the present into the past, looking for explanations that weren't there? The truth was simpler and more painful. People changed. The boy who'd spent summer afternoons helping me rebuild the dock, who'd listened with genuine interest as I explained the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, who'd asked for bedtime stories about the houses I'd built, that boy had grown into a man I barely recognized. When had it started? I traced the timeline backwards, looking for the moment when concern became condescension, when love became obligation. Maybe it was college when Ethan discovered there was a world beyond Clearview Lake, one where fathers were measured not by the calluses on their hands, but by the numbers in their bank accounts. Maybe it was his first job in the city where success meant corner offices and client dinners and a lifestyle that required explanations I couldn't provide. Or maybe it was Caroline's diagnosis. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 4 years ago, autumn like this one, when the doctors had used words like aggressive and metastatic and palliative care, with the casual precision of carpenters discussing wood grain. Caroline had taken the news with characteristic grace, already planning how to spend whatever time remained. But Ethan had looked at me as if I'd somehow failed him, as if a better father would have prevented this, would have found a way to keep death from touching our family. I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at Caroline's garden. She'd spent her last good months there planting bulbs she'd never see bloom, tending roses she'd never smell again. "Promise me you'll keep it going," she'd whispered during one of those endless hospital nights. "Promise me something beautiful will still grow here." I'd promised, and I'd kept that promise, teaching myself the difference between annuals and perennials, learning which plants needed deadheading and which should be left alone. The garden still bloomed every spring, a riot of color and fragrance that Caroline had orchestrated from her hospital bed. But Ethan had never asked about it, had never noticed the way I'd preserved every corner exactly as she'd designed it. After the funeral, something had shifted between us. The shared grief I'd expected never materialized. Instead, Ethan had thrown himself into work, into his marriage, into anything that didn't require him to sit with sadness. And I'd retreated into this house, into routines that kept Caroline's presence alive, into a solitude that felt safer than risking more loss. We'd become strangers who shared a name and a history, but no common language for what came next. The phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. For a wild moment, I hoped it might be Ethan calling to apologize, to say he'd been wrong, to ask if we could try again. But the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Dalton." "This is Patricia Monroe." I should have hung up. Instead, I found myself saying, "Mrs. Monroe. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence rather than charm. I wanted to follow up on our conversation this morning. There's nothing to follow up on. I think there might be. You see, Richard? May I call you Richard? I understand this is difficult. Change always is, especially for people of our generation. Our generation. As if we were peers, as if her 70-odd years somehow gave her the right to speak for mine. But sometimes, she continued, what feels like loss is actually opportunity, freedom, a chance to discover what comes next. I've discovered what comes next, I said. It's staying right here. In this big empty house. Richard, be honest with yourself. When was the last time you used the guest bedrooms, the formal dining room, the study? You're rattling around in all that space like a man who's forgotten how to live. The words stung because they carried a grain of truth. I did rattle around sometimes, moving from room to room, like a ghost haunting his own life. There were spaces I barely entered anymore. Caroline's sewing room, where her half-finished quilt still waited on the cutting table. The guest bedrooms we'd prepared so hopefully for grandchildren who'd never materialized. The study where I used to pay bills and plan home improvement projects that no longer seemed necessary. But emptiness wasn't the same as purposelessness. This house held 32 years of marriage, 3 years of mourning, and a lifetime of memories that couldn't be measured in square footage. "Mrs. Monroe," I said, "with all due respect, you don't know me well enough to tell me how to live. No, but I know Ethan, and I know how much he worries about you. We all do. Ethan worried enough to visit twice in the past year. If that's his definition of concern, I'm not impressed." Silence stretched across the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had lost its practiced warmth. "You're being selfish, Richard. Family means compromise. It means putting the needs of the group ahead of your own wants. Whose family, yours or mine? We're all family now. That's what marriage means." "Marriage," I said slowly, "means a lot of things, but it doesn't mean one family gets to absorb another like a hostile takeover. I don't think you understand the situation. Gerald and I aren't asking for charity. We're willing to pay rent, to contribute to utilities, to help with maintenance. This could be mutually beneficial. You want to be tenants in my house? We want to be family, real family, the kind that supports each other. I walked to the living room window, looking out at the dock, where Caroline and I had shared morning coffee for 32 summers, where I still shared it with her memory every day the weather allowed. "The answer is no," I said. "Richard, the answer is no. Don't call here again." I hung up and immediately unplugged the phone from the wall. The sudden silence was profound, almost sacred. Outside, a red-winged blackbird landed on the feeder Caroline had hung from the oak tree. It pecked at the seeds I'd refilled that morning, then flew away, leaving the feeder swaying in the October breeze. The afternoon passed slowly. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. I tried to watch television, but nothing held my attention. Finally, I went to the garage and pulled out my tools, spreading them on the workbench Caroline had bought me for our 20th anniversary. The familiar weight of the hammer, the precise edges of the chisels, the satisfying click of the tape measure these things still made sense when nothing else did. I found a piece of oak I'd been saving for the right project and began to plane it, smooth, losing myself in the rhythm of the work. Wood didn't lie. It didn't manipulate or cajole or guilt you into doing things you didn't want to do. It simply was what it was, revealing its true nature, only under careful, patient attention. As the shavings curled away from the blade, I thought about Ethan's childhood visits to this same garage. How he'd stand on a step-stool, tongue poking out in concentration as he helped me sand a board or hold a piece steady while I measured. How his eyes had lit up when I'd let him use the drill press for the first time, his small hands steady under my guidance. "Why do you build things, Dad?" he'd asked once, maybe 8 years old, covered in sawdust from head to toe. "Because building something that lasts feels good," I'd told him. "Because when you make something with your hands, you put a piece of yourself into it. Long after you're gone, that piece remains." He'd nodded solemnly as if filing away wisdom for future use. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that lesson. Or maybe he'd learned a different one, that things built by hand could be dismissed, discarded, sold off when they became inconvenient. The light was fading when I finally put away my tools. I'd accomplished nothing productive, had simply moved wood shavings from one place to another, but my hands felt steadier, my breathing calmer. Sometimes the point wasn't accomplishment. Sometimes it was just the reminder that you still had purpose, still had skills that mattered. I made myself a simple dinner: grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that tasted like childhood. Caroline would have added herbs to the soup, maybe a side salad to balance the richness of the cheese. But Caroline wasn't here, and I was learning to be okay with simple things done simply. As darkness settled over the lake, I sat in my chair with a cup of coffee, watching the lights of distant houses flicker on across the water. Other families were settling in for the evening, children doing homework at kitchen tables, couples discussing their days, grandparents reading bedtime stories over video calls with faraway grandchildren. I wondered what Ethan and Madison were doing right now. Were they strategizing their next approach, researching assisted living facilities they could recommend? Or had they simply written me off as a stubborn old man who'd eventually come around when loneliness wore down his resistance? They didn't understand that loneliness wasn't my enemy anymore. I'd made peace with it, had learned to distinguish between being alone and being lonely. Caroline's presence still filled this house in ways that had nothing to do with physical occupation. Her books still lined the shelves, her plants still thrived under my care, her voice still whispered in the settling of timbers she'd helped me choose. This wasn't just a house. It was a marriage made manifest love, translated into lumber and stone and glass. Every room held stories, only I remembered now, the way she'd hummed while cooking, the sound of her typewriter when she was working on her newsletter for the garden club, the squeak of the floorboard outside our bedroom that had warned us when teenage Ethan was trying to sneak out after curfew. Ethan wanted me to trade all of that for the sterile comfort of an assisted living facility where every surface would be sanitized and every memory would belong to someone else. Where I'd be Richard from 304 instead of the man who'd built a life with his own hands. I understood his motivations, even sympathized with them to a degree. Watching your parent age was frightening. Imagining them alone, potentially in need of help that might not come, was a burden no child should have to carry. But his solution, removing me from everything familiar, everything meaningful, wasn't protection. It was erasure. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times its sound, echoing through rooms that had heard that chime nearly 12,000 times since Caroline and I had bought it at an estate sale in Millbrook. We'd argued about the price. She thought it was too much. I thought it was too beautiful to pass up. She'd been wrong about the money. I'd been right about the beauty. but we'd both been right about its importance to our home. That clock had measured our marriage in quarter-hour increments, had marked the passage of days both ordinary and extraordinary. It had chimed through birthday parties and Christmas mornings, through quiet Sunday afternoons, and sleepless nights when one of us was sick. It had counted down Caroline's final weeks with mechanical precision, indifferent to our prayers for more time. Now it measured my solitude, and I found comfort in its constancy. Some things endured, some things kept faith, even when people didn't. I finished my coffee and began the evening routine, checking the locks, turning off lights, setting the automatic timer for the porch light that would come on at dawn. In the bedroom, I paused before Caroline's dresser, where our wedding photo still sat in its silver frame. We looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. She wore her grandmother's dress and the pearl necklace I'd given her for our first anniversary. I wore a rented tux and an expression of stunned joy that I'd managed to convince this remarkable woman to spend her life with me. "They want me to leave," I said to her image. "Our son wants me to give up everything we built together." The photograph, of course, didn't answer, but I could imagine what she'd say if she could. Caroline had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes mattered. She'd fought the insurance company when they'd tried to deny coverage for my heart surgery. She'd fought the county when they'd wanted to rezone our road for commercial development. She'd fought her cancer with grace and determination until the very end. "Fight," I could almost hear her whisper. "Don't let them take what's ours." I turned off the bedside lamp and lay in the darkness listening to the house settle around me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressure from Ethan and his in-laws. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had chosen together. They could ask, they could plead, they could guilt and manipulate and threaten, but they couldn't make me leave. Not unless I chose to go. And I had no intention of choosing anything that would dishonor the woman who'd made this house a home, or the 32 years of marriage that had been the greatest accomplishment of my life. The fight was just beginning. I woke before dawn, not from any sound or disturbance, but from the strange clarity that sometimes comes after a sleepless night spent thinking. The kind of clarity that cuts through confusion like a blade through soft wood, revealing the grain beneath. I lay in the darkness for a few minutes, listening to the house breathe around me, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: purpose. In construction, you learn that every project begins with a foundation. You survey the land, you test the soil, you calculate load-bearing requirements. Only fools start building without understanding what they're working with. Ethan and his in-laws had made their opening move, but they'd revealed their hand too early, shown me exactly what kind of ground we were standing on. They wanted me gone. Everything else, the concern for my welfare, the talk of family obligation, the carefully constructed arguments about practicality, was window dressing. The truth was simpler. I was an obstacle to their comfort, an inconvenience to be managed. I rose and made coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, my movements automatic, but purposeful. Through the kitchen window, the lake was invisible in the darkness, but I could hear the gentle lap of water against the dock, the sound that had been our lullaby for 32 years. By the time the sun crested the pine trees, I was sitting at Caroline's desk with a yellow legal pad making lists. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "What I know." Underneath, I began cataloging facts with the methodical precision I'd once used for project estimates. Ethan's financial situation ambitious, but possibly unstable, given the expensive lifestyle and the need to house his in-laws. Madison's parents' retired lease ending, looking for a permanent solution they couldn't afford elsewhere. The timing of their visit coordinated, plans suggesting they'd been discussing this for weeks or months, without including me in the conversation. On the second page, what I own. The house free and clear. 43 acres of lakefront property worth considerably more now than when Caroline and I had bought it. The contents furniture I'd built art. Caroline had chosen a lifetime of accumulated possessions that had meaning beyond their monetary value. My construction business officially retired, but still generating income from commercial properties I'd built and continued to manage. On the third page, what I can do. Here I pause, pen hovering over paper. In my younger days, I might have relied on physical intimidation, the implied threat of a man who'd spent decades working with his hands. But I was 73 now, and besides, that wasn't who Caroline had married. She'd fallen in love with a builder, not a destroyer. I could be smarter than they expected. Ethan saw me as a relic, a man clinging to the past, because he couldn't adapt to the present. Let him think that. Let them all think that. Underestimation was a gift I could use. At 8 o'clock, I called Marcus Henley. Marcus had been my lawyer for 25 years, handling everything from property acquisitions to contract disputes to Caroline's will. He was my age, maybe a year or two younger, with the kind of sharp mind that had served him well in a career built on paying attention to details others missed. More importantly, he was a friend who'd known Caroline, who understood what this house meant to both of us. "Richard," he said when his secretary put me through. "How are you holding up?" "I need to see you," I said without preamble. "Today, if possible. It's about the house." "What about the house?" "Someone wants to take it from me." There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. "Can you be here at 10? Marcus's office occupied the top floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of solid, unpretentious space that inspired confidence rather than awe. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal texts that looked well-used rather than decorative. His desk was cherrywood, probably built sometime in the 1940s, scarred but dignified. I told him everything: Ethan's visit, the in-laws' demands, Patricia's follow-up call. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the same yellow legal pads I favored. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "They can't force you to sell," he said. "Not legally. The house is yours, titled in your name alone, since Caroline's passing. But that doesn't mean they can't make your life difficult." "How?" "Emotional pressure, financial pressure if they can find leverage. Adult children have been known to claim their parents are no longer competent to make decisions about their own welfare." The words hit like a physical blow. "They'd try to have me declared incompetent. I'm not saying they will. I'm saying it's a tool people sometimes use when other methods fail. It's hard to prove and harder to stick, especially if the alleged incompetent person has good legal representation." He smiled slightly. "Which you do. What do I need to do?" "Document everything, every conversation, every phone call, every interaction. If they're planning something more aggressive than family guilt, they'll show their hand eventually. We want to be ready." Marcus opened a file drawer and pulled out several forms. "We should also update your documentation. Power of attorney, healthcare directives, living will. Make sure everything is current and crystal clear. If someone challenges your competency, we want bulletproof evidence that you've been thinking clearly about your future." I spent the next hour going through paperwork, updating beneficiaries, clarifying my wishes for medical care and end-of-life decisions. It felt morbid, planning for my own decline, but also strangely liberating. These were my choices, my decisions about my own life, no one else's. "One more thing," Marcus said as we finished. "Have you considered making it harder for them to contest your will or challenge your property ownership? How? A trust. Transfer ownership of the house to a revocable living trust with you as trustee. It accomplishes the same thing as outright ownership. You control everything during your lifetime, but it makes the property much harder to challenge or manipulate after your death. And if I want to sell, as trustee, you can do whatever you want with trust property. The only difference is the legal structure. Think of it as insurance." I signed the preliminary paperwork that afternoon, authorizing Marcus to draw up the trust documents. Outside his office downtown, Millbrook bustled with afternoon activity. Young mothers pushing strollers, retirees window shopping, teenagers who should have been in school loitering near the coffee shop. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by family betrayal and property disputes. On the drive home, I stopped at Henderson's Hardware, the store where I'd bought supplies for countless projects over the years. Tom Henderson was behind the counter, as he had been for 40 years, his apron stained with the honest dirt of useful work. "Richard," he said, looking up from an invoice, "haven't seen you in a while. How are you managing?" "Getting by. Listen, Tom, I need some security equipment. Motion sensors, maybe a camera system. Nothing too elaborate." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. "Everything all right out at the lake?" "Probably, but I'd rather be careful than sorry." He nodded and led me to the back corner of the store, where boxes of electronic equipment sat on metal shelving. "Most folks go wireless these days," he said, pulling down a package. "Easy to install, connects to your phone. You can monitor everything remotely." I bought a basic system, 4 cameras, motion detectors, a central hub that would alert me to any unusual activity. Tom offered to install it, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself to understand completely. Back at the house, I spent the rest of the afternoon reading instruction manuals and planning camera placement. One overlooking the driveway, one focused on the front door, two covering the sides and back of the house. Nothing paranoid or excessive, just basic precautions any sensible homeowner might take. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the chess games Caroline and I used to play on winter evenings. She'd been the better player, with an intuitive understanding of strategy that often caught me off guard. "You think too much about individual moves," she'd tell me. "Chess isn't about the next move. It's about the move after the move after the next move." I was thinking about that now. Ethan's opening gambit had been direct but clumsy, a frontal assault that had revealed his intentions too clearly. Whatever came next would be more subtle, more carefully planned. I needed to be ready. The camera installation took most of the next morning. I mounted them high enough to avoid casual tampering, but positioned to capture clear images of anyone approaching the house. The motion sensors went near the windows and doors most likely to be used for unauthorized entry. When I finished, I tested the system from inside the house, watching myself on the phone screen as I walked the perimeter. It felt strange seeing my own property through the lens of suspicion, but Caroline would have understood. She'd always been practical about protecting what mattered. That afternoon, I called my bank and scheduled a meeting with the manager. If Ethan and his family were planning financial pressure, I wanted to understand my own position clearly. 25 years of steady income from my construction business had left me comfortable, if not wealthy. The house was paid off. My medical expenses were manageable, and I lived simply enough that my needs were modest. "You're in good shape, Richard," Janet Morrison told me, as we reviewed my accounts. She'd been handling my banking for 15 years, had known Caroline well enough to send flowers to the funeral. "Better than most people your age. Is there something specific you're concerned about? I want to make sure no one else can access my accounts. No family members, no emergency contacts, just me." "Of course. Is there a reason you're worried about that?" I considered how much to tell her. Janet was trustworthy, discreet, but she was also part of a small community where gossip traveled fast. "Family complications," I said finally. "Nothing dramatic, but I want to be careful." She nodded and made notes in my file. "We can set up additional security measures. Password requirements, verbal confirmation for any large transactions. Whatever makes you feel more secure." Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control, not over other people or their decisions, but over my own circumstances, my own responses. For too long, I'd been reactive, letting grief and loneliness dictate my choices. Now, I was being proactive, building defenses, preparing for whatever came next. The late afternoon light was golden on the lake when I pulled into my driveway. A flock of geese passed overhead, their calls echoing across the water as they headed south for the winter. Change was coming. I could feel it in the cooling air, in the way the shadows fell longer each day. But change didn't have to mean surrender. I spent the evening in my workshop not building anything specific, but simply enjoying the feel of tools in my hands, the satisfaction of precise work. Wood didn't lie or manipulate or guilt you into decisions you didn't want to make. It responded to patient, skillful attention with predictable results. As I worked, I thought about tomorrow's tasks. Marcus would have the trust documents ready for review by the end of the week. The security system would deter casual interference and document anything more serious. My finances were secure, my legal position strong, but most importantly, I was thinking clearly again. The fog of grief and confusion that had clouded my judgment for months was lifting, replaced by the sharp focus I'd once brought to complex construction projects. I knew my materials understood, my foundation had calculated the load-bearing requirements. Ethan wanted a fight. He just didn't realize he'd picked one with someone who'd spent a lifetime building things to last. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times as I put away my tools. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation or coercion. But tonight, for the first time since Caroline's death, I felt ready for whatever came next. This was my house, my property, my choice. And I was done being pushed around by people who confused love with control, who mistook accommodation for weakness. The real fight hadn't even started yet, but it was about to begin. I was still in the workshop when my phone buzzed against the workbench. The screen lit up with Ethan's name, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something told me this call was different. This was the moment they'd stop asking and start demanding. "Hello, Ethan?" "Dad." His voice was tight, controlled. "We need to talk." I thought we did that yesterday. No, we need to really talk. About what's going to happen with the lake house. I set down my chisel and leaned against the workbench. Through the garage window, I could see the porch light Caroline had insisted we install, casting its warm glow across the front steps. I told you what's going to happen. Nothing. That's not realistic, Dad. Madison's parents are moving in next weekend, with or without your permission. The words hung in the air like a challenge. No more polite requests or carefully worded suggestions. This was an ultimatum delivered with the casual confidence of someone who believed resistance was futile. Is that so? I kept my voice level. Look, we've tried to do this the easy way. We've been patient, we've been respectful. But Gerald and Patricia have nowhere else to go, and frankly, you're being unreasonable about the whole thing. Unreasonable? Yes, unreasonable. You're one man in a 4-bedroom house. They're a family in need. It's simple math. Simple math? I repeated. And what happens to me in this simple math? You go to Clearwater Gardens. Patricia already called. They have an opening. It's a nice place, Dad. Meals provided, activities, medical staff on site. You'd be better taken care of there than you are here. Better taken care of. As if I were an invalid who couldn't be trusted to butter his own toast. And if I refuse... The pause was long enough to tell me everything. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had cooled several degrees. Then we'll have to explore other options, such as, Dad, you're 73 years old. You live alone in an isolated house. You've had heart problems. It wouldn't be hard to demonstrate that you're no longer capable of making sound decisions about your own welfare. There it was. The threat Marcus had warned me about delivered by my own son with the clinical precision of a surgeon making an incision. You'd have me declared incompetent. I'd have you evaluated by qualified professionals who could determine what's best for your health and safety. What's best for my health and safety, I said slowly, or what's best for Gerald and Patricia Monroe. They're family now, Dad. When you marry someone, their family becomes your family. That's how it works. No, Ethan, that's how you've decided it works. There's a difference. I could hear him breathing on the other end, the sound of a man trying to control his temper. When he spoke again, the patience was gone, replaced by something harder. I'm trying to help you here. We all are. But if you force our hand, we'll do what we have to do. The papers are already drawn up. All it takes is one signature from a doctor saying you're not competent to live alone, and a judge will appoint a guardian to make decisions for you. And you've already picked that guardian. I'm your son. It's the natural choice. You were my son, I said quietly. I'm not sure what you are now. The silent stretch between us, years of accumulated disappointment and misunderstanding settling like dust. Finally, Ethan's voice came back softer, but no less determined. 1 week, Dad. Gerald and Patricia will be here next Sunday with a moving truck. You can be packed and ready to go to Clearwater, or you can make this ugly for everyone. Your choice. My choice, I said. Thank you for reminding me that I still have one. I hung up before he could respond, then stood in the garage for a long time, listening to the October wind rattle the windows. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the pines, its voice wild and free. Inside the house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. 1 week. They'd given me 1 week to surrender everything Caroline and I had built, everything we'd loved, everything that made life worth living. 1 week to accept defeat and shuffle off to some sterile facility where I'd be Richard from 2 to 8, watched over by strangers who'd count pills and monitor bathroom visits and call it care. I walked back into the house, turning off lights as I went checking locks out of habit. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window looking out at the lake. The moon was rising, casting a silver path across the water that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. They thought they held all the cards. They thought I was a lonely old man with no options, no allies, no ability to fight back. They'd calculated their move based on who they thought I was, weak, isolated, dependent on their grudging affection. They were wrong on all counts. I went to Caroline's desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. At the top, I wrote battle plan. Underneath, I began listing actions in order of priority. Call Marcus first thing in the morning. Expedite the trust documents. Document everything, every threat, every conversation, every attempt at manipulation. And then because some fights require more than legal maneuvers, I added one more item, prepare the house. Ethan wanted to move his in-laws into my home. Fine. But he was about to learn that some houses fight back. I folded the paper and slipped it into my shirt pocket next to my heart. Caroline's house deserved better than surrender. And so did the man who'd promised to protect it. The war was no longer coming. It was here, and I intended to win. The morning after Ethan's ultimatum, I was dressed and ready before the sun cleared the tree line. Some nights change you, strip away illusions you didn't know you were carrying, and leave you standing on solid ground for the first time in years. I'd spent 3 years since Caroline's death, drifting, letting grief make my decisions. That ended last night. By 7:30, I was sitting in my truck outside Marcus Henley's office, watching the early commuters hurry past with their coffee cups and briefcases. Normal people heading to normal jobs, unaware that a few blocks away, an old man was preparing for the fight of his life. Marcus arrived at 8 sharp looking, surprised to see me waiting by his door. "Richard, everything all right?" "No," I said simply, "but it's about to be." In his office, I told him about Ethan's call, repeated the threats word for word, while Marcus took notes with the methodical precision of a man who'd heard similar stories before. When I finished, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said, "and they're being more direct about it. That's actually good for us." "How is any of this good?" "Because they're making threats they can't follow through on, at least not easily. Having someone declared incompetent requires medical evaluation, court hearings, substantial evidence of cognitive decline. You're sharp as ever, Richard. Any doctor who examines you will confirm that." "But they could try." "They could, and we're going to make sure they fail spectacularly." Marcus pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my associate who specializes in elder law. We're going to fast-track your trust documents and add some additional protections. By the time we're finished, your property will be bulletproof." "How long?" 3 days, maybe 4. They gave me a week. Marcus smiled grimly. "Then we'll have time to spare." While Marcus made his calls, I drove across town to see an old friend. Tommy Kowalski had worked construction with me for 15 years before opening his own security company. If anyone could help me prepare the lake house for unwelcome visitors, it was Tommy. I found him in his shop, a converted garage filled with electronics I couldn't begin to identify. He looked up from a bank of monitors when I walked in, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Rick Dalton, I heard about Caroline. I'm sorry, buddy." "Thanks, Tommy. Listen, I need your help with something." I explained the situation, keeping to the basics. Family pressure, threats, the need to protect my property from people who thought they could just move in. Tommy listened without judgment. Men like us understood that sometimes family could be the enemy. "You want to make them uncomfortable," he said when I finished. "I want to make them leave." Tommy's grin turned predatory. "Now you're talking my language." We spent the next 2 hours going over possibilities. Motion-activated lights that would flood the property at the slightest movement. Sound systems that could broadcast messages or ear-splitting alarms. Door locks that could be controlled remotely activated or deactivated from my phone. Video cameras that would record everything and upload it automatically to a secure server. The beauty of modern technology, Tommy explained as he loaded equipment into his van, is that you can make a house seem haunted without breaking any laws. Everything we're installing is perfectly legal home security. And if they try to disable it, that's tampering with security equipment. Class A misdemeanor in this state, possible felony if they cause damage. Plus, the backup systems will keep recording even if they think they've shut everything down. By noon, we were back at the lake house, Tommy's van parked in the driveway like an ambulance at an emergency. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was performing surgery on my own home, installing a nervous system that would let it defend itself. The cameras went up first, small enough to be discreet, but positioned to capture every angle of approach. Motion sensors followed, linked to a control system that could flood the property with light at the touch of a button. Tommy installed speakers in the eaves, barely visible, but capable of broadcasting messages across the entire property. "Voice activation," he asked as he programmed the system. "What do you mean?" "You can record messages that play automatically when the motion sensors are triggered. Warning messages, legal notifications, whatever you want." I thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "Set it up." The door locks were the final touch electronic deadbolts that looked ordinary, but could be controlled from anywhere in the world with an internet connection. Tommy showed me how to operate everything from an app on my phone, a simple interface that gave me complete control over my property. "Test it," he said, handing me the phone. I tapped the screen. Instantly, lights blazed across the yard, bright as stadium floods. A recorded voice echoed from the speakers. "This is private property. You are being recorded. Leave immediately or law enforcement will be contacted." "Jesus!" Tommy laughed. "You're going to give them nightmares." "Good." While Tommy finished the installation, I called my doctor and scheduled a complete physical and cognitive evaluation. If Ethan wanted to claim I was incompetent, I'd have recent medical records proving otherwise. Dr. Patricia Morrison had been Caroline's physician too, and she knew me well enough to document that I was as sharp and healthy as any 73-year-old had a right to be. "Any particular reason for the sudden interest in a complete workup?" she asked when I explained what I needed. "Family complications?" I said. "I want documentation that I'm thinking clearly. Richard, anyone who questions your mental capacity hasn't spent 5 minutes talking to you, but I'll be happy to put it in writing." Next, I drove to the hardware store and bought supplies for a project I'd been putting off since Caroline's death, installing better locks on the outbuildings, securing the garage, and workshop against casual intrusion. Tom Henderson helped me load everything into the truck, asking no questions, but offering quiet support. "Heard there might be some family troubles," he said as I paid for the hardware. "Nothing I can't handle." "I'm sure, but if you need anything extra pair of hands, someone to keep an eye on the place, you know where to find me." That simple offer of help hit me harder than I expected. For months, I'd been so focused on my loss that I'd forgotten about the community Caroline and I had built over 32 years. We had friends, neighbors, people who genuinely cared about our welfare. I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. "Thanks, Tom. I might take you up on that." Back at the house, I spent the afternoon installing new deadbolts and window locks, working with the steady rhythm of a man who'd spent his life with tools in his hands. Physical work helped me think, helped me plan. Each turn of the screwdriver was a decision made, a line drawn in the sand. As I worked, I thought about Caroline's strength in her final months. She'd faced her diagnosis with a grace I still admired, making lists of things that needed to be done, people who needed to be contacted, arrangements that needed to be made. She'd approached her own death the way she'd approached every challenge in our marriage, with clear eyes and steady hands. "You'll be fine without me," she'd said during one of our last conversations. "You're stronger than you think you are." I doubted that then. I didn't doubt it now. The sun was setting by the time I finished securing the property. I stood on the front porch looking out at the lake that had been our sanctuary for 3 decades. The water was calm, reflecting the orange sky like a mirror. A loon called from somewhere across the water, its voice wild and free. My phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. "Have you thought about what we discussed? The time is running short." I typed back, "I've thought about it. The answer is still no." His response came quickly. "You're making a mistake, Dad. Don't force us to do this the hard way." "There is no hard way," I replied. "This is my house. It will remain my house." No response came. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and went inside, checking the new security system one more time. Every sensor was armed, every camera was recording, every lock was secure. In the kitchen, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the table where Caroline and I had shared thousands of meals. The house felt different now, not just the electronic hum of the security equipment, but something deeper. It felt defended, protected, ready. After dinner, I called my neighbor across the lake, Betty Jenkins. She and her husband had been our friends for 20 years, the kind of neighbors who borrowed sugar and shoveled driveways and kept an eye on things when you were out of town. "Richard, how are you holding up?" "Well enough. Betty, I need to ask you a favor. If you see any unusual activity at the house over the next week, cars you don't recognize, people moving around at odd hours, would you give me a call?" "Of course. Is everything all right?" "Family complications, nothing dangerous, but I want to know if anyone comes around when I'm not there." "You can count on us. Bob's got those binoculars from his bird-watching phase. He'll keep an eye out." That night, I sat in Caroline's chair by the living room window, watching the lights across the lake and thinking about the battle to come. Ethan believed he held all the advantages, youth, legal connections, the moral authority of a concerned son. He'd counted on my isolation, my grief, my unwillingness to fight. He'd miscalculated on every count. I had something he didn't understand, the accumulated strength of a lifetime spent building things that lasted. I'd weathered economic downturns, difficult clients, impossible deadlines, and personal tragedy. I'd learned that the best defense wasn't avoiding conflict. It was being so well prepared that conflict became pointless. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times its familiar voice, echoing through rooms that no longer felt empty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressure, new attempts to make me surrender what was mine. But tonight, I was ready. The house was ready. And for the first time since Caroline's death, I felt like the man she'd married, the one who'd built this life with his own hands, and wasn't about to let anyone take it away. The war had begun in earnest, and I intended to fight it on my own terms, from ground of my own choosing, with weapons they'd never see coming. Let them try to take what was mine. They were about to discover that some things and some men don't surrender easily. The call came at dawn on Friday, 3 days before Ethan's deadline. I was already awake, sitting in the kitchen with my first cup of coffee, watching the mist rise off the lake like smoke from a dying fire. The caller ID showed Marcus Henley's office number. "The trust documents are ready," he said without preamble. "And I've added something extra. Can you be here in an hour? I'll be there in 40 minutes. Marcus was waiting with a thick folder spread across his conference table. The papers looked official and intimidating, exactly what I'd hoped for. But it was the single sheet clipped to the front that caught my attention. "Irrevocable transfer of ownership," Marcus explained, pointing to the document. "As of this morning, the lake house no longer belongs to you personally. It belongs to the Richard and Caroline Dalton Memorial Trust, with you as the sole trustee during your lifetime." What does that mean in plain English? It means Ethan can't touch it. Even if he somehow managed to have you declared incompetent, which he can't, the house would still be protected. The trust is bulletproof, Richard. I've made sure of that. I read through the documents carefully, understanding growing with each page. Caroline would have loved this, the elegant solution, the way legal language could be used as armor instead of attack. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. "The trust includes a provision for charitable disposition upon your death. If you have no surviving family members who meet certain criteria, respect for your wishes, demonstrated care for your welfare, the property transfers to a veterans assistance organization. The criteria written into the trust: any beneficiary who attempts to force you from the property, who threatens your autonomy, or who acts against your clearly stated wishes is automatically disqualified." The beauty of it took my breath away. Ethan's threats hadn't just failed, they'd disqualified him from any future claim to the property. His greed had cost him everything. How long before this is legally binding? It's binding now. I filed the paperwork this morning. As far as the law is concerned, Richard Dalton no longer owns the lake house. The trust does, and you control the trust, absolutely. I signed where Marcus indicated each signature, feeling like a small victory. When we finished, he handed me a certified copy of the trust documents. "Keep this with you," he said. "If anyone questions your authority over the property, show them this. And Richard, I'd recommend not telling Ethan about the trust until you absolutely have to. Why? Because the look on his face will be priceless." I spent Friday afternoon preparing for what I knew would be Ethan's final assault. The security system Tommy had installed was tested and retested until I could operate it in my sleep. I programmed additional messages into the speakers, recorded in my own voice, with Caroline's firmness. "This is private property. You are not welcome here. Leave immediately." Saturday brought unseasonably warm weather, the kind of false spring that sometimes appears in late October, confusing the trees and fooling the flowers into thinking winter might wait another month. I used the warmth to complete my preparations, checking every camera angle, every motion sensor, every electronic lock. That evening I called Tom Henderson at the hardware store. "Tom, I might need that favor you offered." "Name it." "Tomorrow, probably around noon, there might be some commotion at my place. People trying to move into the house who don't belong there. If you hear about it, would you mind driving by? Maybe bring a couple of the boys from the volunteer fire department. Official business, neighborly concern. Sometimes the presence of witnesses prevents people from doing things they might regret." Tom chuckled. "I understand. We'll keep an eye out." Sunday morning dawned gray and cold. The fall spring vanished overnight. I made my coffee extra strong and ate a breakfast large enough to last the day. This was no time for hunger to cloud my judgment. At 11:45, I positioned myself in Caroline's chair by the living room window, the trust documents in my lap, my phone in my hand. The security system hummed quietly around me, every sensor armed, every camera recording. The house felt like a fortress, not hiding from the world, but ready to defend itself. At exactly noon, Ethan's black SUV turned into my driveway, followed by a moving truck that looked large enough to hold the contents of a small apartment. Behind the truck came a white sedan that I recognized as Gerald and Patricia's car. I activated the security cameras and watched the convoy approach. Ethan got out first, dressed in work clothes instead of his usual business attire. Madison emerged from the passenger seat looking grim and determined. Gerald and Patricia climbed out of their sedan, surveying the property with a proprietary air of new owners. Two men in coveralls got out of the moving truck and began opening the back doors. I could see boxes and furniture inside. They'd come prepared for a complete takeover. I waited until they'd all gathered in front of the house before I pressed the button that activated the security system. Instantly, the property was flooded with brilliant white light, bright enough to make them squint and shield their eyes even in daylight. The speakers crackled to life with my recorded message, "This is private property. You are being recorded. Leave immediately." The effect was immediate and satisfying. Gerald stumbled backward. Patricia clutched her chest, and Madison let out a small shriek. Even Ethan looked startled, though he recovered quickly. "Dad!" he shouted toward the house. "Turn that off. We need to talk." I let the message repeat twice more before deactivating the system. In the sudden quiet, I could hear Patricia's voice high and sharp. "What was that? Gerald, what was that?" I waited exactly 60 seconds, long enough for them to think the crisis had passed, then opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. I was dressed in my best suit, the one I'd worn to Caroline's funeral, and I carried the trust documents in a leather portfolio that Marcus had provided. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying across the yard. "You seem to be lost." Ethan stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Dad, what the hell was that light show?" "Security system, new installation. I've had some concerns about trespassers." "We're not trespassers, we're family." "Are you—" I descended the porch steps slowly, deliberately. "Because family usually calls before they show up with moving trucks." Gerald had recovered his composure and moved to stand beside Ethan. "Richard, we understand you're upset about the changes, but this is for the best. We've brought our things and the movers are here to help you pack." "Pack for what?" "Your move to Clearwater Gardens," Madison said, her voice artificially bright. "We've already spoken to the administrator. They're expecting you this afternoon." I looked at the four of them standing in my driveway like an invasion force, then at the moving truck with its crew of hired muscle. They'd planned this, carefully orchestrated it to give me no choice, no time to resist. They expected me to crumble under the pressure, to accept defeat with the dignity of a beaten man. They'd miscalculated. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," I said, opening the leather portfolio. "You see, I no longer own this house." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread across their faces. "What do you mean?" Ethan demanded. "I mean exactly what I said. As of Friday morning, this property belongs to the Richard and Caroline Dalton Memorial Trust." I held up the trust documents. "I am the trustee, which means I control the property, but I cannot be forced to sell it or give it away." Patricia was the first to understand the implications. "You can't do that. You can't just—" "I can, and I have." I turned to face Ethan directly. "Your threats about having me declared incompetent motivated this decision. Thank you for that. In attempting to take my property through legal manipulation, you've disqualified yourself from any future inheritance." Ethan's face went white, then red. "You bastard, you spiteful old bastard." "Language, son, your mother wouldn't approve. Don't you dare talk about Mom. She would never have let her son threaten her husband." I cut him off. "She would never have stood by while her family was torn apart by greed, and she certainly would never have allowed strangers to invade the home we built together." Gerald stepped forward, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Richard, be reasonable. We can work this out. Surely there's some accommodation." "The accommodation is simple," I said. "You leave, now. Take your moving truck, take your possessions, and find somewhere else to impose on. We have nowhere else to go." Patricia's composure finally cracked. Our lease is up. We have no money for deposits. You're condemning us to homelessness. Your housing situation is not my responsibility. It never was. The moving crew had been watching this exchange with a professional detachment of men who'd seen family disputes before. Their supervisor approached Ethan. "Sir, what do you want us to do? We can't unload if there's a property dispute." Ethan looked at me, then at the house, then at his in-laws. I could see him calculating, trying to find an angle that would salvage the situation. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Put everything back in the truck," he said quietly. "Ethan!" Madison's voice was sharp with panic. "You can't just give up. Make him what it's his property. He's made his choice." As the movers began reloading the truck, I noticed vehicles approaching from both directions on the lake road. Tom Henderson's pickup appeared, first followed by 2 more trucks with volunteer firefighter decals. Bob Jenkins drove past, slowly in his sedan, his bird-watching binoculars hanging around his neck. My neighbors had come to witness this moment to show support without making a fuss about it. The message was clear. This was my community, my home, my place in the world, and they wouldn't let it be taken from me without a fight. Patricia was crying now, quiet sobs that shook her shoulders. Gerald put his arm around her, his face gray with defeat. Madison stood frozen, staring at the house, as if she could will it to be hers through sheer determination. But it was Ethan who surprised me. Instead of anger or recrimination, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: respect, the grudging acknowledgement of a man who'd been outplayed by someone he'd underestimated. "You planned this," he said quietly. "All of it, the trust, the security system, even having witnesses here. I plan to protect what's mine, what's ours." I gestured toward the house. "Your mother and I built this life together. I won't let it be destroyed by people who see it as nothing more than a real estate opportunity." Ethan nodded slowly. "I guess I deserve that." The moving truck was loaded and ready to leave. The supervisor handed Ethan a clipboard to sign, and the convoy began to reassemble. Gerald helped Patricia into their car, her sobs audible even through the closed windows. Madison climbed into the SUV without looking back at the house. Ethan was the last to leave. He stood in my driveway for a long moment, his hands in his pockets, looking at the home where he'd grown up. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said finally. "Not about trying to get the house, about the way I tried to get it. I know you are. Will you ever forgive me?" I looked at my son, the man he'd become, not the boy he'd been, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but an end to the anger that had been eating at me for days. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give or withhold," I said. "It's something you'll have to find for yourself." He nodded and walked to his SUV. As the convoy pulled away, I noticed Tom Henderson's truck following at a discreet distance, making sure they actually left the area. I stood in my driveway until the sound of engines faded completely, then walked back into the house that was truly mine again. The security system powered down automatically, the cameras returning to standby mode, the sensors resetting themselves. In the sudden quiet, I could hear the familiar sounds of home, the grandfather clock marking time, the house settling into its bones, the whisper of wind through the trees Caroline had planted. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat in her chair by the window, watching the lake reflect the afternoon sky. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, its voice wild and free. Tom Henderson's truck appeared briefly on the far shore, making one final patrol before heading home. The trust documents lay on the side table, proof that what we'd built here would outlast all of us. Caroline's vision preserved in legal language that no amount of family pressure could overcome. I raised my coffee cup toward her photograph on the mantel. "We did it," I said quietly. "We protected what we built." The house settled around me with a sound like contentment, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt completely at peace. The battle was over. The war was won. And the lake house would remain what it had always been, a sanctuary built on love, defended by strength, and destined to endure long after the voices of greed and manipulation had faded to silence. 3 days passed in blessed quiet. The security system remained armed but unused its cameras, recording nothing more dramatic than deer wandering through the yard and the occasional delivery truck turning around in my driveway. The lake reflected the changing sky with its ancient indifference, and I found myself falling back into the rhythms that had sustained me before Ethan's ultimatum shattered my peace. I was splitting kindling for the fireplace when I heard the familiar crunch of gravel under tires. A single vehicle this time, no convoy, no moving truck, just Ethan's black SUV creeping up the driveway like a dog returning home with its tail between its legs. I set down the splitting maul and watched through the kitchen window as he sat in the driver's seat for nearly 5 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house. When he finally got out, he moved like a man walking to his own execution, slow, deliberate, resigned. He knocked on the front door, a soft, almost apologetic sound that was nothing like the confident arrival 3 days earlier. I waited a moment before answering, not out of spite, but because I needed to prepare myself for whatever came next. When I opened the door, I saw my son as he truly was, not the prosperous businessman in the expensive suit, not the entitled heir demanding his inheritance, but a tired man in his 40s who looked like he'd aged years in the past week. "Dad," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stepped back and let him enter. He looked around the hallway as if seeing it for the first time, his eyes lingering on Caroline's photographs, the antique mirror she'd found at an estate sale, the coat rack I'd built from barnwood, salvaged from her grandfather's farm. "Coffee." I offered more from habit than hospitality. "Please." We sat at the kitchen table, where Caroline and I had shared thousands of meals, where family decisions had been made and family arguments had been settled. The irony wasn't lost on me that this final conversation between father and son would happen in the same spot where Caroline had once mediated our disagreements with patience and wisdom. Ethan wrapped his hands around his mug, but didn't drink. His wedding ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, the same light that had illuminated Caroline's face during countless similar conversations. "Madison left me," he said, without preamble. I didn't respond immediately. Some confessions require silence to settle properly. "When?" I asked finally. "Yesterday. Took her parents with her. They're staying with her sister in Portland while they figure out what comes next." "I'm sorry." He looked up sharply. "Are you really—" I considered the question seriously. Was I sorry that my son's marriage had ended, that his plans had crumbled, that the pressure he'd tried to put on me had backfired so completely? "I'm sorry you're in pain," I said carefully. "I'm sorry your marriage couldn't survive this crisis, but I'm not sorry that your attempt to take my house failed." Ethan nodded slowly. "Fair enough." We sat in silence for a while. Through the window, I could see the lake beginning to show whitecaps as the afternoon wind picked up. A storm was coming. I could feel it in the way the light had changed in the restless energy of the air. "I need you to understand something," Ethan said finally. "This wasn't just about Gerald and Patricia needing a place to live. I know. Do you really?" He leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgency I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, trying to explain why he'd missed curfew. "Madison's been pushing for this since Mom died. She said we were stupid to let you warehouse all this property when we could be building wealth with it." Building wealth. Her words, not mine. She never understood what this place meant to you and Mom. To her, it was just an asset sitting idle. I sipped my coffee thinking about the woman who'd stood in my driveway 3 days ago, staring at my house with the calculating gaze of someone pricing real estate. "And you—" What did you think Ethan was quiet for so long? I thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought you were dying in this house, slowly, quietly, but dying all the same. After Mom passed, you stopped living and started just existing. I convinced myself that forcing you out would save you. Save me from what? From becoming a ghost haunting your own life." The words hit harder than I'd expected, because there was truth in them, more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. For 3 years, I had been going through the motions of living, without really engaging with life. I'd maintained the house, tended the garden, kept busy with projects, but I'd also been waiting for what I couldn't say, for Caroline to come back, for the pain to fade, for death to reunite us. Maybe I was dying, I admitted. But that was my choice to make. Was it, though? Because the man I watched fade away after Mom's funeral, that wasn't the father who raised me. That wasn't the man who built this house with his bare hands, who ran a construction company, who never backed down from a challenge. I looked at Ethan across the table, really looked at him, and saw something I'd missed in all our recent conversations: grief. He'd lost his mother too, but more than that, he'd lost the father he'd known. In trying to force me back to life, he'd pushed me further away. Your mother's death changed me, I said. It was supposed to. 47 years of marriage doesn't end without leaving scars. But it doesn't have to end with giving up. I never gave up. I just learned to live differently. Alone? Alone? I agreed. But not lonely. There's a difference. Ethan finally took a sip of his coffee, making a face at the temperature. It's cold. I stood to refill both our mugs from the pot, a simple domestic gesture that felt loaded with meaning. How many times had Caroline done this same thing during family conversations? How many problems had been solved over fresh coffee at this table? Tell me about Madison, I said as I sat back down. What do you want to know? Why you married her? He was quiet for a moment, surprised by the question. She was beautiful, smart, ambitious. She made me feel like I could be more than just the small-town boy who helped his dad with construction projects. And now? Now I wonder if she ever loved me or just loved what she thought I could become. The bitterness in his voice was familiar. I'd heard it in my own thoughts during the dark months after Caroline's diagnosis, when I'd wondered if God was punishing me for some sin I couldn't identify. What about Gerald and Patricia? Where do they go now? I don't know. Madison said they'd figure something out. I think her sister has a guest house. He shrugged. Not my problem anymore. They were never your problem to begin with, weren't they? When you marry someone, don't you take on responsibility for their family? To a point, but not at the expense of your own family, not by betraying the people who loved you first. Ethan flinched as if I'd slapped him. Is that what I did? Betrayed you? I thought about the moving truck in my driveway, the threats about competency hearings, the casual dismissal of everything Caroline and I had built together. Yes, I said simply. That's exactly what you did. We sat with that truth between us, like a stone thrown into still water, its ripples spreading outward until they touched everything we'd ever been to each other. I wanted you to be proud of me, Ethan said finally. I was proud of you. I am proud of you when you give me reason to be. But not lately? Not lately. I agreed. The storm I'd sensed earlier was beginning to show itself. Rain spattered against the kitchen window, and the wind picked up enough to rattle the screens. Soon it would be a full downpour, the kind of October storm that stripped the last leaves from the trees and reminded everyone that winter was coming. I need to ask you something, Ethan said, his voice careful, and I need you to be honest with me. All right. Do you forgive me? I studied my son's face, seeing the boy he'd been overlaid with, the man he'd become. The question he'd asked wasn't simple, and it deserved more than a simple answer. Forgiveness isn't something you can ask for and receive like a transaction, I said finally. It's something that happens over time through actions, through proof that the person who hurt you has truly changed. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now. Ethan nodded slowly. What would it take for you to forgive me? Time, distance, evidence that you understand what you did wrong and why it was wrong, and most importantly, assurance that you'll never do anything like it again. To you, you mean? To anyone. Your children if you have them. Your next wife if there is one. Anyone who trusts you enough to let you into their life. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. I could see lightning flickering in the distance, still too far away to hear the thunder, but close enough to feel the electricity in the air. I should go, Ethan said, standing, before the storm gets worse. I walked him to the front door, both of us aware that this might be the last conversation we'd have for a very long time, maybe forever. Dad, he said as he reached for the door handle, I want you to know something. These past few weeks seeing you fight back, watching you outmaneuver all of us, it reminded me of the father I grew up with. The one who taught me that a man protects what's his and doesn't back down from bullies. Even when the bully is your own son. Especially then, he opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The rain was falling steadily now, not yet the deluge it would become, but enough to send him hurrying to his SUV. I stood in the doorway and watched him drive away his taillights, disappearing into the storm. When I could no longer hear his engine, I closed the door and turned the deadbolt not out of fear, but out of habit. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, made cozier by the storm outside. I built a fire in the fireplace, not because I needed the heat, but because Caroline had loved the sound of rain on the roof and fire in the grate. Some of my happiest memories were of evenings like this, the two of us reading in comfortable silence, while nature put on a show outside our windows. I poured myself a glass of the wine. Caroline had loved a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion that had never come. Tonight felt special enough, not celebratory exactly, but significant. A ending that was also a beginning. As I sat in Caroline's chair with my wine and my memories, I thought about Ethan's question, "Do you forgive me?" The honest answer was that I didn't know yet. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you could flip, a decision you could make in a moment of clarity. It was a process like healing from a wound. It happened gradually, cell by cell, day by day, until one morning you woke up and realized the pain was gone. But I also knew this. I was no longer angry. The rage that had sustained me through the battle for my home had burned itself out, leaving behind something cleaner and more durable. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but acceptance. The understanding that people make choices and choices have consequences, and some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. The storm reached its full fury around midnight, wind howling through the trees and rain lashing against the windows. But inside, I was warm and dry and safe, surrounded by everything Caroline and I had built together. The trust documents lay in the desk drawer, legal proof that our sanctuary would survive whatever came next. I raised my glass toward her photograph. "We won," I said quietly. "Not just the battle, but the war. The house is safe." Lightning flashed, illuminating the lake for a brief moment before thunder rolled across the water. The storm would pass, as all storms did. Tomorrow would bring calmer weather and clearer skies. And I would still be here in the house we'd chosen together, living the life we'd built with our own hands. Some things endured. Some things couldn't be taken away, no matter how hard people tried. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and I finished my wine. Time for bed, time to rest, time to dream of the woman who'd made all of this possible, and the man I'd found the strength to become in protecting her memory. The storm raged on, but inside our sanctuary, all was peaceful and still. 6 months later, I woke to the sound of spring rain tapping gently against the bedroom window. Not the furious downpour of that October storm, but the soft, patient rain that coaxed tulips from the earth and painted the world in shades of green Caroline had loved. I made my coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, the same ritual I'd performed every morning for 3.5 years since her death. But something had changed in the months following Ethan's departure. The coffee tasted better. The silence felt companionable rather than oppressive. The house no longer echoed with absence, but hummed with presence, hers mine, and the accumulated weight of all the life we'd shared within these walls. The trust documents had done their work. Marcus called occasionally with updates, interest from the Veterans Organization about future programs, tax implications I needed to understand, legal housekeeping that kept everything secure. But mostly the paperwork sat in Caroline's desk drawer, a quiet insurance policy that let me sleep peacefully. I'd heard nothing from Ethan since that rainy October night. No calls, no letters, no attempts at reconciliation. The silence might have worried me once, but I'd learned to read it differently now. Sometimes silence was the most honest form of communication, an acknowledgement that some wounds needed time to heal before they could be examined. Through the kitchen window, I watched the lake emerge from morning mist like a developing photograph. The dock I'd rebuilt last month stretched into water that reflected the pale sky. Caroline's garden was showing the first brave shoots of the perennials she'd planted, faithful soldiers returning for another season of beauty. I'd spent the winter months in useful solitude, reading books I'd been meaning to get to for years, learning to cook meals that weren't just fuel but actually had flavor, taking long walks around the lake that reminded me how beautiful this place was, how lucky I'd been to share it with someone who appreciated its quiet magic. The mailbox at the end of the driveway had become my daily pilgrimage, a 1/4-mile walk that served as both exercise and meditation. Most days brought bills and catalogs and the occasional letter from old friends. But this morning, tucked between the electric bill and a seed catalog, was an envelope that made me pause. Ethan's handwriting. My name and address in the careful script Caroline had taught him when he was 7 years old. No return address postmarked 3 days ago from Portland. I carried it back to the house, unopened, setting it on the kitchen table while I finished my coffee. Some letters demanded immediate attention. Others were better read when you were ready to hear what they had to say. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once with a photograph tucked into the crease. The letter was brief. Dad Madison and I are divorced. It was finalized last month. She's remarried already, a real estate developer from Seattle who can give her the life she always wanted. I'm living in Portland now, working construction again. Nothing fancy, just honest work with my hands. It feels good. I've been thinking about what you said about forgiveness being earned through actions over time. I'm trying to become the kind of man who deserves forgiveness even if it never comes. The picture is from last weekend. I thought you should see it. Ethan, I set the letter aside and picked up the photograph. It showed Ethan in work clothes standing beside what looked like a Habitat for Humanity construction site. His face was thinner than I remembered, weathered by outdoor work, and perhaps by harder lessons than he'd expected to learn. But his eyes looked clearer, more focused than they had in years. He was smiling, not the practiced smile of the businessman who'd tried to take my house, but the genuine grin of a man who'd found satisfaction in building something useful with his own hands. I studied the photo for a long time, seeing echoes of the boy who'd helped me in my workshop, who'd learned the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, who'd once told me I was the strongest man in the world. Maybe people could change. Maybe the lessons that seemed to fade could find their way back to the surface when circumstances stripped away everything false and left only what was true. I walked to Caroline's desk and opened the drawer where I kept my important papers. Next to the trust documents was a folder I'd started but never finished, a collection of photographs from Ethan's childhood, the good memories I'd been unable to look at during the worst of our conflict. I slipped his new photograph into the folder, not as forgiveness but as acknowledgement. A recognition that the story wasn't over that time had a way of revealing truths that anger and hurt could obscure. The spring rain had intensified, drumming against the roof with the steady rhythm of renewal. I built a fire in the fireplace, not for warmth, but for the comfort of watching flames dance while water fell from the sky. Caroline had loved mornings like this, when the house felt like a ship riding out a gentle storm. I settled into her chair with a book I'd been reading, a biography of a man who'd built great buildings and lost them all, only to discover that his true legacy lived in the apprentices he'd trained, the techniques he'd passed down, the love of craftsmanship he'd inspired in others. At noon, the rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Sunlight broke through the clouds, setting the wet world sparkling like a jewelry store window. I put down my book and walked outside to breathe air that smelled of earth and growing things. The lake stretched before me, mirror calm now that the rain had passed. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, that wild, lonely sound that Caroline had said, reminded her that some things remained unchanged even as everything else shifted around them. I thought about Ethan in Portland, learning again to find satisfaction in honest work. I thought about the house that would outlast us both, preserved by legal documents but sustained by something deeper. The understanding that some things are worth protecting, that love leaves traces that can't be erased by conflict or time. The afternoon sun warmed my shoulders as I stood on the dock Caroline and I had rebuilt together 20 years ago. The water lapped gently against the posts, patient and persistent as time itself. I had no way of knowing if my son and I would ever sit together again at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and conversation like the family we'd once been. Some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt, but others could be constructed from new materials on stronger foundations if both sides were willing to do the work. For now, it was enough to know that he was building again houses for families who needed them alive, based on something more solid than the pursuit of wealth. It was enough to know that the house Caroline and I had loved would endure, protected by law and sustained by memory. As the sun began its descent toward the western shore, I walked back to the house that was completely, finally, unquestionably mine. The grandfather clock chimed the hour with its familiar voice, marking time in a place where time moved differently, not as a countdown to ending, but as a steady accumulation of moments worth preserving. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it toward Caroline's photograph. "Another day in the house you loved," I said quietly. "Another day of keeping the promise I made you." Outside, the lake reflected the evening sky like polished metal, and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue. The loon called again, its voice carrying across the water like a benediction. Some things lasted, some things endured, and some men learned eventually that the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies, but protecting what you loved from those who couldn't understand its value. The house settled around me with sounds of contentment, and I was home. If you like this ending type, like.